Good afternoon. Welcome to the Hidden Landscape series. Today we'll be screening Working Together to Unlock the Mysteries of Stone Ruins. Our guest panelist is Evan Pritchard, who is the director of the Center for Algonquian Culture. A note, we have a new feature, which is the closed captions along the bottom of your screen. So if this is distracting or if you'd wish to remove that, you have the option to click out of it by finding the CC icon at the bottom of your screen, and you will be able to eliminate those, the captions. So I'm David Brule. I'm the spokesman for the Nolambika Project Incorporated. We're a nonprofit organization made up entirely of volunteers. And we are dedicated to providing the public with opportunities to learn about the history, life ways, and persistence of Indigenous peoples in our region. Please feel free to contact us with your questions about our projects at nolambikaproject.org on Facebook, or at our email, nolambikaproject@gmail.com. We hope that you're enjoying the series and that you'll enjoy the film this afternoon. We would greatly appreciate your donations. We are all offering our services to you, the public, in hopes of preserving our Indigenous landscape, but we need your donations to help pay for programs such as this. You know what that's like. Please consider donating to help our efforts. We always begin our events with a land acknowledgement. We always acknowledge that we are all occupying and benefiting from Indigenous lands. The first peoples have lived here for tens of thousands of years in balance and reciprocity with the earth. The voices and spirits of those ancestors are still here in the air around us, and their descendants are still here living among us. We must continue to be thankful to this earth and to our fellow creatures with whom we share the wonderful gifts of our rivers, forests, hills, and plains. We give thanks to all good things. We also have a couple of fairly important sponsors we'd like to thank. One being the Karuna Center for Peace Building, founded 25 years ago in Amherst, Massachusetts. It has an outreach that ranges across the planet to reach more than 40 countries, many of which have been affected by violence. You can get information about the center by checking out www.karunacenter.org for more information. We are also greatly appreciative of the River Valley Co-op based in Northampton, Massachusetts. It's a retail grocery business, cooperatively owned by 11,000 community members. The co-op specializes in local products, is committed to building a sustainable local food system. In recognition that the co-op is benefiting from land that was taken from the First Nations people, River Valley has the commitment to working with us, the Nolambika Project, and with other groups to support the work of Native American historic and cultural preservation. We are deeply indebted to filmmaker Ted Timreck, who since 1976 has been exploring and filming sites that will be the focus of this series that we are presenting. Ted holds a research position in the associate program of the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History. He's been working with the museum's Arctic Studies Center since 1980. Ted has been breaking new ground with Doug Harris, as you will see. Doug Harris, whom we will meet shortly, is the moving force behind efforts to locate ceremonial stone landscapes and preserve these sites as important parts of our cultural heritage and national treasure. Together, Ted and Doug have blended scientific research methodology with Indigenous insights, knowledge, and wisdom to provide us with a unique and remarkable body of work that crosses cultural lines. Our guest panelist is Evan Pritchard, director of the Center for Algonquin Studies. He's the author of more than 50 books. He's an adjunct professor and has taught courses on Native American studies at Marist, Vassar, and Pace. So during the film, please use the question and answer option as your questions arise. That will give us a chance to coordinate questions during the film, and we will be ready to field those questions once that film is completed and the question and answer session begins. So I'm going to turn this now over to our filmmaker, Ted Timreck.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to us. This is our third episode of Hidden Landscapes. And in this episode, what we've tried to do is bring native, scientific, environmental, and antiquarian voices together. And besides the information that is in the narrative itself, and of course it's packed, I'm hoping that you will see that the combination of all of these disciplines working together are what we really need to understand and move forward in the idea of preservation. So it's this, there's a lot of material in here, but it's how it all works together that I hope you'll pick up on.
It's a pleasure to have Doug, Ted, and Evan with us today. Please put your questions and answers in the Q&A, and the speakers will respond. To begin with, Evan will share a graphic he is sure we will all appreciate.
Okay, I wanted to comment on the Rhinebeck turtle, as some people call it. And one of the things, of course, is location and how it sits in the environment. And so I'm going to share a screen here. Can you see this? Can you
Yes.
see this? Sorry. Okay. So, yeah, one of the things I noticed when they showed the graphic of the inland sea of the Hudson, I noticed that this turtle was right on the shoreline. Well, that would have been many thousands of years ago. But also, the position is where many people would say was an ancient boundary. In fact, during colonial period, the boundary between the Wappingers and the Mohicans was within walking distance of the Rhinebeck turtle, just to the north. But also the east-west position of it seems to also have been possible boundary. That's like to say that ridge. And so it may be at a corner. So I've always believed it was kind of a boundary marker because it's also that is still a fairly low latitude compared to most ceremonial cairns. The ones that, for example, have the lighting stone facing certain directions. This one doesn't have that. But when you look at this map, you see that the Rhinebeck turtle is about 2 miles from the Hudson, 2 miles east, and it's in that rise, just that crest, and it aligns with another known boundary marker turtle, which was found by Ed Lennox in 1987, and New York Times did a story on that, and then that drawing of it ended up on a book cover, so it became very well known, and that's in the Bronx. It was on the shore of the Bronx River, or the Aquahong, as you call it in Algonquin, and now is in the Bronx or New York Botanical Garden, so to be viewed by whoever wants to view it. And the original location of that, I asked Glenn Preisberg to do a computer, estimation of their longitudinal alignment, and it is almost exact. And again, that's not based on the precise positions, but it's within 3 seconds of a degree, which is very, very little. That's feet. We're talking feet, but they're 70 or so miles apart. And then both seen as boundary markers by like Atlantic and myself for in terms of respectively, that would kind of make sense, because I've often believed that, in the early days of the Munsee, which according to archaeologists comes suddenly into form about 1000 AD. And also you see that there's this symbol of a turtle associated with the leadership of the greater Munsee, both the Minisink and the Esopus. And so if you see Oratam's picture, he always has, he's a great chief of this old leadership group. He has a turtle hanging on his necklace. So that's one part of it. I believe that turtle, the symbol of the leadership and of these early proto-Muncie people. And both of these turtles are in alignment, but also along this line. I mean, this is, like I say, within 3 seconds of a degree, incredible precision. However, along the line is a couple of other interesting sites. So that should be noted. And I know, Ted, you mentioned that there was a parallel line, which you may want to comment on, but in coming up in the next movie, so that's a segue. But also I want to say that the Bucks County squarish cairn has the small stones on top, and this one also does too, or did have. So you can walk up on the Rhinebeck turtle easily and then stand on it comfortably because of the small stones. But we've never mentioned that there's an Elizaville quartzite kind of intrusion here, and some of the stones actually have what I call racing stripes, that 1-inch quartzite kind of line going right through a stone, making it all the more amazing because we know turtles don't race. But that's my initial comments, and like I said, I think it's a great movie with or without me, and proud to be a part of such a special film.
This first question is specifically for Doug. Shutesbury, once again, is in need in its preservation of ceremonial stone landscapes. How can we enter a memorandum of agreement with town officials so that they understand the sacred value of these stone prayers? Thank you.
Well, thank you for that question. The United South and Eastern Tribes has agreed to participate with towns, and at some point we'll enter this discussion, possibly in a future segment. But the process that is required is for tribal representation to communicate between the responsible party, landowner or town agency, and the National Register of Historic Places. And it is that process that we hope to facilitate. We have an attorney who has stepped forward, Attorney Peter Vickery, and the United South and Eastern Tribes Executive Director, Kitchke Carroll, has agreed that United South and Eastern Tribes will serve as a broker between towns, landholders, and the National Register of Historic Places. We're working out the details of how that will function through a memorandum of understanding. So at some point, we will give you, the public, the information as to how to reach Kitchke Carroll and the United South and Eastern Tribes, and they will facilitate towns like yours in protecting.
The next question, I don't quite understand myself, so I apologize if I don't read it correctly. I'd love to hear more about the perspective shift theory related to when the indigenous people took to the water. There was one interesting geometric suggestion in an artifact.
Wow, I guess that's thrown to me. That's a really long one. And all I can suggest is that I've got another film coming out that specifically covers the maritime revolution for Native Americans in northeastern North America. And somehow, if we can all stay in communication, I'd be happy to have this released in this kind of a forum when it's finished. But we're working hard on that very issue because I'm glad it's interested you, because it's really significant, because it just destroys the stereotypes more than anything else I can think of in terms of Eastern Native cultures going back. And we now have some archaeological dates going 20, 23,000 years that you would hear about in this movie. So all I can suggest is that somehow you hang in there and we get this thing finished and available to people. But it is coming, so that part I know for sure.
To be added to that, we're not the people that you thought came across the Bering Straits. we arrived here quite differently and have been here since time immemorial. We've been here, and that you need to know and you need to honor.
I want to mention that tried to quote from National Geographic about this ancient site, and when I tried to get permission, they wouldn't give it to me. So I called the fellow that was working on the site, and he picked up the phone. He was way up in Alaska in the corridor area. He said, "No, that's not true. We don't have sites that old. They just made that up. I'm right here." You know, it's like, I don't know why they do that. But anyway, he said he welcomed me to come up and dig with him to see like these, what artifacts there were, but they weren't as old as they were being reported to be.
And I could add to that in the since we're in specifics, that Dennis Stanford from the Smithsonian has been holding for some time that the age of any Clovis points that you find in Alaska are much younger than the Clovis points that you find on the Atlantic shores of Virginia. The in-between area is Colorado or New Mexico or Clovis, New Mexico, where they were first found. And our finding those points in the West simply made us think, once we paired that with the Beringian theory, that of course this is a Western phenomenon. And it's beginning to look much more like the Eastern phenomenon of Clovis is stronger, earlier, and more, actually more profound than what you find out in the West. And the final nail in that, of course, is the fact that apparently the Clovis points found in Alaska are much later than the ones found in the southeastern or mid-Atlantic states of the United States today.
Yeah, the Southeast is interesting. There was a recent study on the Tennessee River, and there's Clovis sites all along the Tennessee River, which is quite long, going into the extreme Southeast, but it's an ancient riverway. And so, it indicates that at least some of them had boats, by the way, in my summation of that whole study. Tennessee River.
Well, I'm also reminded that by this film we've just seen, that we were at the north end of the Susquehanna River in Pennsylvania. And the Susquehanna River is the one along which the people whose points are being found and are diagnostic of how old the ancient sites are along the coast. This particular area, the stones were mined up along the Susquehanna River and were brought down and placed in sites that are now under ocean water. So at the time, these sites were clear land that the ocean waters had been sucked up by the glaciers, and that left open land for people along the coast to go down and occupy, to go down and hunt on. And we're just now beginning to realize how significant those ancient sites are, because they were the habitation sites, the ancient habitation sites for our coastal people. They are now under the ocean waters, but at that time, that those ocean waters had been sucked up into the glaciers, and the people were able to go down and hunt mastodon, hunt other walruses, hunt other ancient animals that were available to them once the glacial waters, the glaciers had sucked up the waters of the continental shelf. Continental shelf, don't forget it. We're going to submit that to you as a place of habitation for ancient Indians out on the continental shelf.
This may all seem incredibly complicated because it really is, and it's only being figured out now, just barely. But like I say, stick with us. Hopefully we will have an explanation in the video that makes sense to everybody when we can get it out here.
That's to say that we are quite excited about being on the cutting edge of identifying and having scientists and tribal people and others who have suspected these things. And now we're able to prove them. And so we give thanks to people like Dennis Stanford for his role in leading the way, and Ted Timreck for being a good follower in that sense. So thank you, Ted.
Yeah, thanks.
No need.
Well, hey, somebody had to follow the breadcrumbs, and Tag, you were it.
It was the most fun you could possibly have.
Mhm.
Almost.
Okay, the next question. Do you believe ceremonial areas were built by the first people and gathered spirit energy from ceremony and prayers? Or, as above, so below, the mother below calls and draws the people through electromagnetism of deep earth, magnified by quartz, holds consciousness like iPhone and water to signal her sons and daughters. I'm specifically thinking about the Taurus field.
I think this is the point to say, wow, okay, what you just stated is a major revelation, and it reveals some of what we resist attempting to articulate, because to articulate it in contemporary terms often brings us to a point of disagreement, because what some of us experience and what some of us believe scientifically is being encountered may be very different or may be exactly the same. So thank you.
I want to say that in the film, one of the most interesting moments for me when the Tlingit were speaking their language to the land and to the killer whales, and that the killer whales understood the language and brought food. And I have to explain that, while Ted and I were filming that segment, it's hard to divide the objective scientific from the shamanic in this case. So I was having fun and making a break, and even though it was clearly a Muhlenberg mud turtle that was being depicted in that turtle, I have no doubt that's a very ancient form of turtle, and yet her favorite word of mine is takwakl in Mi'kmaq, and many Algonquin languages that means painted turtle, and I didn't think anybody was really listening, so I was making this little ceremonial like thank you takwakl, walal and takwakl. I said it many times. As we were taking a break, maybe Ted was tired, whatever, I know, changing film, but I started doing this. And so I saw this painted turtle coming out of the leaves, and Ted saw it too. And so I went over and picked it up, and lo and behold, it's in the film. So yeah, it wasn't staged at all. And that's that, it's anybody's thinking that happened. And I'm a witness to that. But the fact is, I'd admit that I may have something to do with it. If you believe that, the Tlingit story, then maybe you believe that, an Algonquin guy talking to the turtle spirit there in Rhinebeck would actually somehow result in a painted turtle. But maybe it's coincidence. But we say, you know, that our ancient languages have tremendous power because these words, according to our belief system, were developed by Glooskap by asking these animals and plants what they're for, and they would tell him, and then the name would become part of that identifier as to how to best use these friends, these resources. And so whatever is in the word Tecuaco means something. Painted turtle probably means a lot more than that. And he showed up. So it's certainly totally spontaneous and sincere, and maybe a touch of magic.
And we don't always do a very good job of deciphering the difference between magic, shamanism, and science. We do the very best we can as limited human beings, and quite often that's insufficient for the intellectual minds that are asking the questions.
Right. Yeah, that's a very important comment, because you want to be careful. We're trotting on our medicine here, aren't we? And we should be careful that we leave it for intact for 7 generations. So I never try to sum up or put a cap on anything. And good advice for anybody in this field, or antiquarians, for example, never try to say, well, this is it, and I figured it all out, and this is where it stops, because that's when you get into some trouble.
I'm fascinated that all of these professions and points of view are represented and staffed by men. Has there been any consideration of how to seek, identify, include the knowledge and heritage and voice of women as part of Native tradition, possibly?
I can say right off the bat that Rosita Worrell is one of the most fantastic Native traditionalist scientists from Harvard I've ever met. And when you're searching for these things, whatever comes across your path is what comes across your path. If you try to search for stereotypes or something like that, you'll probably get messed up down the road if that's your purpose. So you have to let these things happen however they do.
And Peggy Jodrey is in which film, Ted?
She was in the last one, I believe.
Last week, yeah.
Right in there. And there, it's I don't know, the respect for different opinions that come male, female. Personally, I don't want to sort that out. I want to wait till it comes to me or across the bow of my ship, whatever it is, and then follow it wherever and from whoever.
Yeah, Peggy is one of the scientists in this world that I most respect, and I have brought her to some, how you say, sensitive sites, trusting her respect for the sensitivity of the site, which I won't even mention in this broadcast, but and she brings a great deal of science to my understanding.
Has OS, well, I'm sorry, Evan, did you have something more to say?
Oh, I just wondered if Doug had any more to say about the role of women and all this antiquarian exploration.
Well, it may be that women are more reticent than some of we men to talk about certain issues. And I can't say whether they are right or wrong. Sometimes we overspeak. Sometimes we should hush when our mouths start running. But we have always been trained that the women will show us the way. And if in fact we are overstepping our bounds, they will check us.
And the great mother, the earth mother spirit is in them in a way that men can't really totally understand. And so we should be checking with even our, us here checking with women on the intuitive side. And I know that happens with that Chief Vinnie Man, brings us, where his wife comes to a lot of these sites, and she's very intuitive. We listen to her.
Well, many of us have been trained by women, And so those women stand as the guardian of our thoughts, and we call on them for advice before starting to open our mouths. But that doesn't mean that we don't sometimes lead with ego, and they will check us. And sometimes when you least expect it, the electronics will remind you that mother is saying no, no, no. So we have to be mindful of those kinds of things.
Has OSL methodology been used to date a Northeast ceremonial stone landscape?
I'm not sure I understand that question. Could you ask it again, please?
I don't know what OSL stands for. Has OSL methodology been used?
That's optically stimulated luminescence.
Thank you. Has been used to date a Northeast ceremonial stone landscape?
We are currently working with scientists to figure out which of the dating systems is the most appropriate and the most respectful. OSL is optically stimulated luminescence is one of the ones that we are examining, but there are other methodologies as well, which we are looking into.
Might Tom Wessel be able to visit us in Wendell? There is a stone pile here.
Oh, I can't speak for Tom at all. He's always been incredibly busy from ever since I first met him. So I don't know, but he's at Antioch or has been up in I can't say today, but I know him as coming from Antioch College. So that would be a good place to start.
He has a couple of books, and it would be helpful for you to read those before asking him to come and share his wisdom.
True.
When one comes upon ceremonial stone cairns, to whom should we notify such a find?
Well, we're in the process of designing what is the most appropriate. If what your goal is to have that, and pardon me for, I don't use the term cairn, Manatu Hasanash is the Algonquin words that I use to describe what a cairn is to some people. Cairns are the description from Scotland and Ireland. And if you were in Scotland and Ireland, you'd be most appropriate. But since you're in Algonquin country, we prefer that Algonquin language is being used. So Manatu Asunash, spirit stones. What the ancients called them, we weren't there, we don't know. What we call them is, with our limited understanding of what the words mean when translated from English into Algonquin or from Algonquin into English. So maybe you can help us with that translation. Evan.
Yeah, there's slight variations from all over this large Algonquin territory, and Oxenal, Manitou Oxenal, for example, much further south, but it's almost the same word. So it is very consistent. Manitou Oxenal, Oxenash. So it's, this spirit stones. Because Manitou really means just simply spirit. It's the word by itself. And there are many words for stones and rocks, but Oxenal, Oxenash is universally understood.
Next question.
Next question.
Are we entertaining the theory that early peoples in the Northeast may have come from the East that is from Europe? If so, do we know whether there are any stone structures similar to the ones found in the Northeast, also found in Northern Europe?
Well, if you think in the most general terms, ceremonial stone landscapes are found in many, many, many places around the world. So it's doesn't really work that you can make specific comparisons. At least it has never worked successfully with the profession. So that's not quite. Personally, I see it related. This is only my own idea. Related to these very early maritime revolutions, these adaptations to the ocean that give you a sense of landscape that gets you to want to mark it, not to mention the astronomy and the alignments and all of that. But that's for later, I suppose. But America has been debating this issue of diffusion, hyperdiffusion, ever since the beginning. And it has shaped a lot of what we argue about, what we think, what we don't think in terms of Native history. And we're not at the bottom of this by any stretch of the imagination, but we are trying to show, at least in work that follows, we're trying to show that Northeastern Native peoples were not the backwater of the world. They were not the last place on Earth that modern humanoid peoples got to. That's not what the archaeology is now telling us. We haven't changed our textbooks yet. So we're in this process of revolution, if you will. It's awfully slow, so it doesn't seem like a revolution, but we're sort of just still beginning to figure out where we are and sorting out the DNA in a way that's absolutely sure on all fronts. That's in our future too, but that'll probably have a great deal more to do with those kinds of decisions. At this point, it's just something that people think about in any way that they're disposed. Sometimes that disposal is political or racist, or there are all kinds of reasons why people come up with different answers to that kind of question. But in terms of finality, we're not there yet, as far as I can see.
And my own comment on that is I've been very interested in the Sami people who are indigenous to Europe, and especially, the Mi'kmaq tradition, always feeling very close to the Sami. In many ways, their cultures are very similar. And some isolated Sami that I've seen films and pictures of are obviously much more Australoid than our current definition of Caucasian, and yet technically Caucasian, but a whole different kind of movement, a different kind of way of being and appearing, more like this Aboriginal, if you want to call them Australians, who were connected during the glacier to a lot of other land. And when you look at this and read about the early these Samis, it really sounds kind of familiar if you're familiar with Algonquins. And so that's, I'll just put that as a kind of a teaser.
Well, Evan, I can, as always, when you bring up specifics, it gives us a ground to stand on. And I can suggest that there's a segment coming up for anyone who's interested that deals with the fact that the Vikings, when they discovered North America by boat 500 years before Columbus, it's been pointed out by the scholars that the Vikings were never surprised that they discovered land across the ocean. It's not like Columbus, it didn't create a revolution. They were just, their culture was never surprised. And some of the great saga historians from our period have suggested that that's because the Viking culture, and I use that term casually here, always expected, and they have proof for this, always expected that there was land on the other side of the Atlantic. It's a legacy that they got from their own Ice Age past. And the bridge to that Ice Age past comes, as Evan is suggesting, in the Sami, because the Vikings believed that the Sami were directly related to the Native American Indians, who they met 500 years before Columbus. That was their understanding. They thought the Sami could just go over the top of the ice bridge between absolute far northern Europe and the land across the Atlantic. Tune in later for the details of that and the illustration of that story. But thank you, Evan, because that's sort of helping get us through these questions and how we're going to deal with them in the future for our audience.
I was just had the good fortune to be in Sami country 2 years ago, and I was struck by the main difference was that they had reindeer and we have moose. And there isn't all that much difference between a reindeer and a moose, in my opinion. But they, they have a relationship with the reindeer, and it's a delicate one, just as we, the Mi'kmaq people have a relationship with the moose.
And in the next film, you will see footage of ceremonial stones being utilized by people, traditional peoples in far, far northern Europe in an unbroken way. They haven't got 500 years of cultural stress on top of themselves. So you will see footage that relates, and this goes back to our viewer's question about the stone monuments and how not only general, but particular the whole issue and how complicated it can be. But there is a whole segment that will help that, I believe, coming up.
Well, we have to be very clear. At the heart of the question that was asked was a Eurocentric reference. And the fact is that although it's Eurocentric, the ancient people were not Caucasian. The ancient people were the Sami in relation to the Skraelings, or Native American Indians. And these are two peoples who had ancient relations with one another. And none of them acknowledged a Eurocentricity or a Europe-centered intellect about where things came from or why things were. It's important for us to recognize that the Europeans that we're talking about are the Sami, the northern Indians of Europe, who are the Aboriginal peoples of that part of Europe.
When I was up there, I got a little lesson in yoiking, and we did experiments where the yoiker was able to transmit an animal somehow, and we all knew which animal associated with the yoiking. That doesn't sound very European to me. And yoiking is a form of chanting or singing, or it's a song like, but just the sound somehow embodied the spirit of an animal that we could actually identify, and you can't explain that rationally, but amazing experience.
And we have to keep in mind that we're talking about cultures that live at the very farthest northern reaches of the subarctic, where we haven't put very much energy at all into researching how deep, constant, and vital the connections between all the peoples around the circumpolar globe just below the Arctic itself are. We just don't know. I mean, we've had many hints of connections, but it seems the more we look at it, the deeper those connections are and the longer and further back they go. And once again, to go back to an original great question, it's about maritime, it's about the ocean, it's about hunting. The edges of ice at the tops of the rims of the oceans were some, and continued to be, some of the richest, most diverse environments that humans could hunt in anywhere on the globe. And there's no reason to imagine why people would not be on those oceans, on those ice edges, taking advantage of the easy hunting that all of that represents.
Well, I think at the heart of the killer whale story is much meaning for all of us, that the ancestor, the elder woman, spoke in a respectful manner to the killer whales and asked for what she needed. And they understood her and brought her a seal and nosed it up to the beach for her and her grandchildren. we cannot forget that. That is the old way. That was the old way when the ancients knew how to talk to each other and respectfully did so. We have forgotten how to talk to each other. We see animals as objects, not as fellow spirit beings. We'll learn.
And we're
Yeah,
just lucky to have the stories that go with that we can still save for people who come after us.
When I was younger, there was some very old native people who I saw talk to animals. It looked to me like the animals understood and responded, but a lot of time has passed, and I see less people able to have that kind of powerful communication with their fellow animals. But I hope that somehow that will not be lost. But again, it's a cultural a cultural difference, or evidence of a deep cultural difference, and and I respect that difference. And there's a different concept of nature, and the word nature you will not find that in most Algonquin dictionaries as a word to translate, because they wouldn't really understand it, because it implies a separation between the humans and the animals, which is what we didn't want. And so I also then studied like the origin of the word nature in European languages, and it turns out it didn't start out as what we think it means to be born of the womb, and that someone who lived in a certain territory would be called, a native of that, because they were born from the womb of that land. But then about 1500 AD, that word's definition started to change, and started it kind of twisted into like, okay, that's outdoors and we're inside, which we don't even recognize so clearly in living, someone's living in a wigwam or wigwam. So the word nature has evolved or been developed or industrially stamped out for us in very recent times, about the time of Columbus. So think about that. That's kind of opens and bends one's mind at the same time.
And I could add one more small complication. It's only relatively recently that we've been reborn to the idea that maritime animals like killer whales and dolphins and that these creatures have a special ability to communicate with themselves. And for decades now, we've been learning a little bit at a time that we might be able to understand it better and better. Think about during the Ice Age, 15 to 25,000 years ago, when humans are for sure adapting to the ocean, they are picking up, speaking with animals of the ocean, and there must have been some kind of a change between that kind of information gathering and the information you gather from land-based animals. And that creates differences in culture between sea peoples and land-based gathering peoples. So all of this begins to percolate into civilization and changes, but only as we learn these things can we reapply it to the past and be a little more forgiving and a little clearer about what they may have understood and how it could have affected them.
In the Mi'kmaq language, there's a word espudek, which I wish we had a word like this in English, because I think our whole history would have turned out better. But espudek means that species over there is more advanced than ours. And that's the word applied to the humpback in particular, but dolphins, cetaceans of all kinds, dolphins, whales, but the humpback turns out to have like a great deal of respect from the native people. And the more you study humpbacks, I'm not going to go in hours about the humpbacks, but they're like yogis, they can control their breath, their bleeding, they control their bleeding. They travel from the Caribbean every year up to our main people, and they can communicate over great distances, and we believe telepathically. Super intelligent, we say they're from Sirius, but I can't prove that. But the thing is that the humpbacks are really kind of regal amongst cetaceans, and that's ones we often think of. In fact, there's a Mi'kmaq hieroglyph. I do believe the hieroglyphs are ancient of the Mi'kmaq. Leclerc wrote them down, and there's one for the humpback. And I just want to say that when I was back in the 1950s, when I was a little had my mother embroidered that symbol on my blanket that turns out to be exactly the same symbol from the ancient hieroglyphs. However that happened, I'm not going to say, but you know, I think a lot of people try to like preserve whatever it was that they managed to receive through the generations. And we definitely have that link to the whales in the oceans.
We must never forget that as males exceeded their role, we lost communication more broadly with other species. We began to talk to animals the way we wanted to hear them talk back to us, as opposed to acknowledging, as the women did, that you must deal with them in a respectful manner. And you, by what you present in a respectful manner, you will gain in return in a respectful manner. The male dominance has been problematic, and we will learn that sooner or later.
One of great, very important. I want to mention the story of Hobomok as taught in Connecticut. You know, Doug, you mentioned Ketanawit in one of the film clips that I've seen of you, and you know, a great spiritual being. And Hobomok lost his temper because the Quinnipiac people forgot how to talk to the animals and how to listen respectfully to the animals and understand them. And that's why he lost his temper. And that's why he started throwing stones into Long Island Sound that became the Thimble Islands and all that. So it was Kaitanawit who had to come him down and kind of put him to sleep, hypnotize him, put a spell on him. So we'd go to sleep and he laid down in Camden, Connecticut. And now we have a mountain. Well, you know, it's an interesting children's story, but in fact, the teaching is that this is an outrage, that we have lost this communication ability with all of these other species that have information and wisdom we need.
Wow, I had never made that connection, so thank you very much.
Kaitanawit, yes.
Yeah, well, and as well to the sleeping giant.
The sleeping giant. It really does look like that on the profile. It has the nose, he's lying down.
Yeah, yeah. So
That's
the people of that area, that's West Haven?
Yes.
Yeah.
In Camden. And unfortunately, some of the missionized of our brethren believed then, they were told that Hobomok was the devil himself. And this really confuses the narrative quite a bit. But he lost his temper, you see. That's all.
Well, I think once you come up the Connecticut River to the turtle, and you find that it is Hobomok who was called to by the people to address the fact that the turtle was not only eating up all the fish, but was eating up the humans as well, they called on Hobomok to resolve that issue. So Hobomok could not have been a devil if in fact he's being called on by the people to resolve a devilish issue.
Exactly. I believe that his name refers to tobacco, because of hobo is the pipe and mock is food. So I believe that Hobomok is food for the pipe. And that's always sacred. Tobacco is always sacred. But again, this is my, theoretical interpretation. I'm not standing by it, but it's speculative.
Glad you brought it up. I'll stand with you.
Okay, brother. Uncle.
Are there any other plants or trees that are associated with Native American ceremonial stone structures? And are there specific directions that the turtle mounds typically face?
Yeah, well, I think it's individual, because the one in Rhinebeck, the head points to the eastern sunrise, but not necessarily at the equinox. Is that one of the other dates? I think it's one of the May-November line dates, but it definitely faces the east. And that's also representative of the lodge. Often the door will face the east in some cases, or in some cases the south. But the trees, yeah, always cedar. There's always, we was planting, our ancestors were always planting cedar in any sacred place so that their grandchildren could enjoy them. Think about that. So that's, and the cedar partly related to the little berries that make you go on a little journey, but I don't want to emphasize that because that's not the only reason they're important. But I just want to say this is something material that references spiritual shamanic journeying. So I want to, that's a question to think about. So there are other, I think persimmons were used at some point as a sign, as seen. Maybe Doug, you can comment on persimmons. I'm not an expert, but there's various trees. The maple tree is a tree of friendship. And so if this were a gathering spot for, friendship between tribes or nations, then there might be maple trees there, sugar maples, because the sap is so sweet. And this is in a Wappingers territory. And, there's a word for maple tree in Wappingers, which means that its blood is like drinking water. And that would be, Misquay Basink. Misquay Basink means it's a tree that has red leaves and that its blood is like drinking water. And that's an interesting phenomenon. This very time of year, the maple sap runs like drinking water. And so that would have been part of it. There are many trees and plants that could potentially be considered sacred. There's a place, by the way, I want to mention Utsayantha, which is not directly north of the Turtle, but a little bit to the west. It's a mountain now, and it's definitely not Lenape. It's a Shawnee word, and the Shawnee lived there. It means the little people who watch over the land. And so, they have, like I said, they were attracted by the Pipsissewa and want to attract them. So it would be a plant that would attract them. And I'd want to think more about that. There are many other plants that would show up, and trees. Just need a moment there.
But depending on the culture, the pine tree is particularly important to Iroquoian people. So we have to be careful how we point to this one, say, oh, this one. No. They're all important. They all have their place in the realm of importance.
What about the Hut Stone caves found in New England, especially noted in the Woodstock, Vermont area, which face winter solstice sunrises between two Vermont hills? Astroarchaeologists in the 1970s were all excited. This has been fascinating. What do you have to say about these?
The chambers are a big question mark. Many people say, oh, well, no, they're just for storing food. Well, the fact is that in Massachusetts, they were referred to as monks' caves. Well, we know that the word comes from monk, comes from mukwashim, or the word for wolf. So these would have been wolf's dens, or would have been significant given that that's what they would have been found as. However, they are used for purposes of ceremony depending on the time of the solstice, and what can be viewed out the narrow passage that you must use to enter these chambers. But they have many functions. What say you?
Well, I going back to the 1970s when I first got involved with this, it turned out that specifically in Vermont with Byron Dix, for example, when he calculated and I got to photograph the winter solstice sunrise in the absolute center of the entrance to one of those chambers, what it did was allow the space to begin to ask for questions about it. Because when you looked at these chambers, you thought, oh, well, these are colonial root cellars, as they were called by almost every professional on the block. But when you notice things like sunrises, etc., it like I say, it gave us the space to start asking more questions. And if you stick with it, more and more questions would come up. It reminds me of what Doug's medicine man, past medicine man, Lloyd Running Wolf Wilcox said. Don't, at least that I, this is the way I've always understood it. He said, don't try to convince people about native stories. Just let the land speak for itself. And I think that that kind of an astronomical alignment to any number of stones or cairns or what have you, whether it's Burnt Hill or so many places that were discovered through all of New England, it opened up the questions. And it was that very let the landscape speak for itself that allowed it to go on without having to, take incredible leaps of faith, cultural. The landscape, working in the landscape for all of this work, whether it's archaeological or symbolic or ceremonial, allows you to keep going for more audiences than not.
The turtle often will be facing the winter solstice sunrise, but not always. And that has to be interpreted. It's just what was found in replicating what directions they head in, what directions they head in. It was usually the winter solstice sunrise, which is.
I want to say, I'm sorry. I say I've been in a number of those so-called root cellars, and root cellars, somebody who sells potatoes. I've been in some that have windows above the door that at the moment of sunrise, a beam of light goes to the back, an upper part of the back wall, and shines upon an area which now is like a shelf. There might have been things, and my thoughts was standing there. This was not a good Christian farmer who built this. This is somebody else who built this. We don't know. I would not rule out early Masonic pilgrims, by the way. Wouldn't rule it out. Wouldn't say it was, but there were Masons here before Columbus. That I'm sure of. And it doesn't rule out Native Americans or intermarriage of the two. But it's definitely struck me as somewhat pagan, if you use the broadest sense. Somebody who had an earth-based religion. That's how strong that feeling was. I just wanted to throw that monkey wrench at you there.
Well, I'll catch it and throw it right back at you. I don't perceive it as a monkey wrench. I think that what we have to do is to acknowledge that a lot of the chambers either have things that we don't understand, and in some instances that may have to do with star alignments. And so many of the stories that we have yet to fully understand come as a result of star alignments. And I encountered that with, well, they weren't Sami, but they were northern Algonquin peoples who came to a ceremony where there was discussion of the stars and the Iroquois songs about the stars. And when these men, it was a medicine man and a chief from the northern peoples of these were peoples who would have been the descendants of Sami. And what happened was that we were at Colgate University, and the person who was leading the discussion was talking about the stories. And at one point, the man traveled, there were two men, medicine man and a chief, and both of them, neither of them spoke English. One of them spoke French, and so there was a translator who could translate from their indigenous language into French, and then from French into English. And at one point, they said something, and we then all stopped, and it was translated to say, "Stop, go back." And we stopped, roll back this particular sky platform to get to the dog star. And they identified the dog star as one that was significant in their culture, and that there was a song and a dance that had to go along with that. So they with the hand drum and the voice, they performed the song and then did the dance. And that was in their culture what you had to do when that was a given acknowledgement. So there's a lot going on that is ancient that we don't understand. And the placement of an opening in a chamber could be for sunlight, could be for the perception of a given star being.
We have our main type of structure, the wigwam, has what some people call a stellar aperture or a celestial aperture at the very top. It's a hole in the top, and that would be mostly the circumpolar stars of the North Star. So I believe that the North Star has particular significance and power. However, in the hieroglyphs, the main star really is the morning star. And so when across Algonquin culture all the way out west, you see this words and symbols in ornamentation. You see star symbols. Some of them have been identified as, I think it's true, to be the morning star. And my adopted elder grandfather was Ojiguano, whose name means morning star, and the morning star shone through the window in his cabin when he was born long ago, over 100 years ago. And they knew that he was going to be a spiritual teacher because of that. So he kept the name Ojiguano his whole life.
Well,
That's two.
we're running short on time. And there's so many good questions here. I'm going to read two of them. And then after that, I'd like all three panelists to add anything that they think we didn't cover today. First question is, are there Canadian connections for analyzing pre-Columbian populations? Since the national border won't have been a factor at the times of these constructions, parts of Canada must be investigated too. Yes? Is that right?
Yes.
Absolutely, and it is being investigated.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Labrador is Canada.
Labrador is definitely Canada, and that's the best place that I know of where ceremonial stone sites have been found that are 4,000 to 8,000 years old that absolutely were not built by colonial farmers.
No
Guaranteed.
graffiti either.
Right.
Yeah, Algonquin, there's an Algonquin Park, and there's a tremendous area of rock that has been covered with petroglyphs. And there's a museum there I recommend people go to. And the thing is that even natives and historians don't really claim to understand all of it. There's a lot of different ideas about what it means, but they're incredibly beautiful petroglyphs. And that's near Algonquin Park, Peterborough, by the way, the Peterborough petroglyphs, and that's in northern Canada. Also, Manitoulin Island will be brought up, I think, in these stones.
It is very profound and moving to hear that the First Nations people are finding scientific proof of such a different ancient story than what has been taught in US schools for our lifetime. Thank you. What are the implications for our First Nations people today?
Well, you raise a very important question. Who you call First Nations people, the indigenous peoples, are resistant to sharing knowledge because it has been abused in the past and it has been exploited in the past. So everybody wants to turn out a book. Everybody wants to make $1. It's the American way. However, there has to be a partnership between those who control the land and those who have an understanding of what must be protected on the land. National Historic Preservation Act says that we must all have a relationship, whether it's the State Historic Preservation Office, the Tribal Historic Preservation Office, or the public. And when it comes down to it, the public has to stand and protect what is ancient on the land.
I want to thank you. I want to mention Robin Wall Kimmerer's work. I don't know if you've read that, Doug, but
Oh, I did. I've met her. Yes.
yeah. Robin Wall Kimmerer has 2 major books that are very sensitive to the native view, and she has Onondaga connections, and it's like gathering moss and braiding sweetgrass. But there's also a little known article she wrote in a science journal way before that, talking about, maybe it wasn't before that, TEK, traditional ecological knowledge. And that article really changed things because that spoke to the scientific community directly in their own language. And so I was giving a speech in Canada at Lecumic, and I had just read this and really excited about this very technical article that explains how, well, the Aboriginal people have, very significant and unique views of the natural world. And so I mentioned there ought to be a department of TEK here in Canada. And it happened that one of the leaders of the Parks Canada Office of Government was in the audience. I didn't know, but they went off and started a department of the government to study and understand and promote the idea of traditional ecological knowledge, which exists today. So that's from my personal experience. And so I have to give credit to Robin for that insight. She's very open-minded about, different cultural perspectives and how they might be separately valid.
Well, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation has begun to acknowledge that same perspective. And so we owe that to Robin and to you. Thank you very much.
I could add a small avenue to this, not speaking as a native, and something that I've had to balance through my whole career. And it goes, I think one of the key elements that has to be dealt with is how long native people have been, or humans have been, living in the northern and southern western hemisphere. And this is an underlying thing that winds up in every newspaper article, what have you, every argument. And from the native point of view, it's time immemorial. And that is a very difficult term to understand beyond the point of forever. And I've had to, crossing science and native perspectives and trying to balance these for many years, the way I've come to look at it is that, to me, this age, this date, this American anthropology has been trying to pin a date when the native people came here. It used to be right over the Beringian land bridge, and it's evolving now. We can go into that much later, but it's always a question of a date, and it's always been pushed back. And I refer to it as a glass basement, and it cracks every time another discovery comes along. And I have a great deal of faith that it is going to keep cracking. It's just going to keep shattering as we've never had a discovery that's put a cap on it at the top end. It's always the discovery that breaks through and adds more years to the bottom, particularly for Eastern Native culture, because that's always considered the most recent, et cetera, et cetera. And that seems to be the most wrong idea of all. But to be able, for an audience, for a general audience, to be able to think of it as a glass basement and realize that it's continually shattering, and we will always come to an earlier date, right down to the point where I think in the future, hominids that we don't even know about are going to finally turn up in the Western Hemisphere. Maybe just a little bone, a finger bone, a bit of a jaw bone, whatever it is, we're going to come to that because it's deep under the ground. Our archaeology isn't anywhere near as advanced as other places, but it's a way to accept time in memoriam scientifically and keep functioning and keep cracking that glass basement and understanding that we will get there, but having the faith that it's always going back to an earlier time. So that's just a sort of like an answer to that question.
When I asked that question of my elder about the Beringian, about coming across Beringia, she said, yes, some of our ancestors may have come across the Beringian land bridge, and they were met by those of our ancestors who were coming up from the Amazon rainforest, and we who have always been here welcomed them both. Now that was what that elder had to tell me. And for me, that was the only answer I know to that question of who came first.
I want to say that, Ted, and both of you, Doug, that at some point we discussed like what is the living evident connection between the extreme East people and the extreme West people in North America. And in fact, there is, and it's quite kind of obscure, but some of the most respected linguists have found a match in the way that vowels are pronounced among Tlingits and others in the high Pacific Northwest, and our Mi'kmaq and most ancient Eastern Algonquin people, that it's in the sound of those vowels. I can't make those vowels. I can speak our modern Mi'kmaq or whatever, but the vowels that the real old elder speakers speak here in the East is amazing. It's swishy, it's magical. And say, I don't know how else to say it. It's beautiful musical. And those same vowels show up in the far Pacific Northwest. And that's why many leading linguists feel that those are all, they call them macro Algonquins or whatever. And I've spoken to leaders of, once in a while I get to meet leaders from some of those Northwest tribes, and they're very proud to be part of the Algonquin language family. There's a link.
Well, the guys who came to Colgate University were Ainu, and they came speaking their indigenous language. One of them spoke French, and it was fascinating to have them have to translate from Ainu to French, French to English in order to be able to communicate with us. But it's important to understand that there are still people in the northern reaches of Canada who follow traditions that we may have lost touch with, who follow star traditions, who follow star song traditions. And those are things that we have to be respectful of, that we have some older cousins who still do what we are about.
There's an Algonquin group that we think of as the Montagnais, but actually call themselves the Innu.
Yeah,
And
same group, yeah.
And looking very superficially, comparing the Ainu with the Innu, they look very, very similar to me. And the similar restrictions on phonemes such as R and V or whatever. And when I retire, which maybe never, I'll maybe go off in a hut somewhere in Canada and I'll study and compare those two languages. It's not at the top of my list, but Innu and Ainu may be very similar.
Would you invite me? No matter how old I get, I'll make that trek with
you. Be fun. It'll be fun.
Okay.
All right, well, thank you, everybody. I wish we had more time. Is there anything else that someone wants to add briefly before we close?
Just thank you.
Oh, this is a great opportunity, and thank you is all that we can really say. Thank all of you for being as a part of this and making this happen.
And I would just say the same. Thank you for Doug and Ted. You know, Ted kind of got me started in some ways. I showed him the turtle, but he showed me a lot of things way back then. And you could tell I was younger then. And so was Ted. He wasn't on camera. But also Doug, you know, both of you have been really great teachers. And David Brill, by the way, also, you don't even know. I read your stuff. But we all, you know, we're all working together. And that, you know, that balance and harmony, Doug, you talked about.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that's the key. Did I say it right? Harmony and balance?
Oh, whichever way you go, you're right
It's
at the
okay.
same place.
With the spirit of Mother Earth, I think that's the salient valedictorian word on all this that we're looking at. Is like our ancient people had a sense of harmony and balance with Mother Earth, and they expressed it through various stone structures, effigy stones, whatever. And that's what I think we can still absorb from being near these stones, is a sense of harmony and balance. And we need it.
Wow. Thank you all very much. Thank the public, people who have been following this. I hope you realized what you've just experienced. This is an incredible opportunity, probably one of the very first ever for a lot of us. We want to thank Evan and Ted and Doug, and our series is continuing. We will see you next week, and I hope that Evan will sit in with us, but as a listener anyway. But we will be having the former Tribal Historic Preservation Officer Tim Mentz, who will be our guest panelist. He was the Standing Rock Sioux of South Dakota, our nation's, the United States, first Tribal Historic Preservation Officer. He is a co-owner of a cultural resources firm that is focused on identifying and protecting Dakota Lakota heritage. That film of Ted's is called The Devil's Footstep, a new vision of early Native life. So I really hope that you will join us. Our panelists can't see this, I don't think, but we have 54 questions still waiting in the wings. And so you can see tremendous interest in this topic. And we are really, the Nolambika Project and Ted and Doug, Evan, are really pleased to have stimulated this much interest. So while I need to say goodbye for a week, please don't forget to support these efforts. We are all volunteers here, and to be able to continue bringing you these kinds of programs, we need your help. So please consider getting in touch with the Nolambika Project and being generous. As I said, we need your help, and we want to be able to continue supporting Ted and Doug in their work. We are aware that this series has brought a tremendous amount of questions to people's minds about protecting sites in your own communities. And so we're working on giving you, perhaps at the end of the next session, a few ideas about how to protect what you perceive as sites in your own community. It's a challenging process, but as Doug has reiterated more and more, it is what the public has to do. You have the responsibility. And so with that, I'll close. It's been a long afternoon. I hope you've all enjoyed the programming, and we hope to see you next week at 2 o'clock for The Devil's Footstep. I put that in quotes, I'm sure. So all the best, everyone, and we will see you in a week. Thanks again to our panelists and to Diane Dix for fielding the questions, and Lise McLaughlin for the engineering. Bye now.